Welcome everybody to this online roundtable between Romantic scholars and teachers. We are hosting this through the Romantic Circles Reviews and Receptions. The editorial team is hosting this in order to have a discussion, a more informal discussion surrounding the recent events of the past 6 or so months. Particularly the effects of coronavirus on our teaching and on our research. So we've invited some panelists here to reflect on this with us, and we're going to have more of more informal discussion. So we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Alex Gatten. I'm on the editorial team with Reviews and Receptions. I just recently completed my PhD at the University of Connecticut, and currently through summer, I am serving as an assistant director of first year writing at UConn. My research focuses on the intersections of gender and sexuality and romantic poetic form, specifically looking at poetic form, the ways people read poetic form as a kind of embodied gendered bodies. I also do scholarship and research in, of course, writing studies as well as part of the work I do at the first year writing program in composition pedagogy. And I use he, him pronouns.
I think also we were going to begin by kind of bringing up the weird coincidence of coming up with this roundtable in the light of COVID. And now that we're hosting it, we're also hosting it amidst the much more positive upheaval of our lives through Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-police protests and anti-racist protests that are happening right now. So that's a context that we might touch on as we speak to each other, but we just wanted to make note of these highly intersecting forms of kind of vulnerability that are coming to the fore, but also in the context of the recent uprisings, a lot of strength and solidarity that's coming through on the streets and in many other ways. So yeah, so I'll go on and just introduce myself now too, I guess. I'm Lenora Hanson. I'm a co-editorial staff person, co-editor of the Romantic Reviews and Receptions. I teach at NYU. My work focuses on intersections between romanticism, theories of figuration, and right now most actively on thinking about the relationship between figuration, romantic use of figuration, and what Marx called primitive accumulation. So all of these weird upended temporalities and labor times and forms of expropriation that laid the groundwork for what we think of as capitalism today. So yeah, that's what I work on. Anna, do you want to go next? Because you're next on my box.
Sure. I'm Anna Shajirat. I use she, her pronouns. I am an assistant professor at Quincy University, which is a regional small liberal arts college in Illinois. My research and teaching focus on women's Gothic writing in the long 18th century, and particularly the way that women writers figure their own form of historiography based on gendered and racialized understandings of the Enlightenment, and particularly critiques of the Enlightenment. Oh, and in terms of speaking to the moment right now, I just want to say I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to all be together here as romanticists, and I think we all have, specialized perspectives on the power and the potential of revolutionary movements. And so I think it would be interesting for us to talk about how our period of study sort of brings to bear on what's happening in terms of the uprisings happening today. And so obviously different conditions that are being responded to in the 18th and 19th century and today. But yeah, I think it's important for us to voice our solidarity, our solidarity, I'll say, with what's happening today.
I'm Carmen Faye. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan in Canada. I'm coming from the University of Central Florida, so I'm just sort of in between right now. I'm currently in Vancouver on the ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It can feel a bit like coming to Canada. I have this distance or space between what's happening in the States right now and what's happening here. But as you know, being a romanticist has taught me, and my recent thinking about border crossing political affects in one of the chapters that I'm working on really makes me think that this revolutionary fervor and the responsibility to be anti-racist really is a border crossing affect too. I work on affect theory, aesthetics, and poetics, and I'm right now writing a book about provocative poetic form and the aesthetic disappointment.
Hi, I am Rebecca Schneider. I use she, her pronouns. I want to thank the organizers for making this opportunity possible and my co-panelists for being in this conversation today. And I finished my PhD in 2019 at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I've been living the adjunct life. Boulder is on the traditional territories of the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute peoples. This fall, I will be starting an visiting assistant professor position at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. So my work has been largely focused on archival research and recovery in terms of finding archival materials that present the experiences, the narratives, the lives of enslaved people and free people of color, specifically those folks who advocated for their own rights to be free and for their own reciprocity and reparations. And as we all know, the Romantic period coincides with the height of the Atlantic slave trade, specifically on the British side of things. And so there's so many conversations that are central to our field that deal with Black lives and these things that have been with us for 400 years, these questions of dehumanization and fights for equality. So the book project that I am working on right now includes recovering these archival materials within modes of established literary critique. So my probably favorite example to throw out there is using runaway slave ads, reading them in the mode of the romantic fragment, to think about the incommensurability in the runaway ads and what types of narratives, what types of larger stories might be recovered through the imaginative labor that we as critics typically would bring to a poem like Ozymandias. Why not also bring that imaginative labor to the narratives? That's the way that I'm framing it in runaway ads. So did I tick all the boxes?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just follow up too, and thank you to Rebecca and Carmen for the land acknowledgement, because one thing that maybe we can talk about later on too is the ways that we're far more attuned to the places that we live right now due to our context of working at home all the time.
Right.
And so I did just want to acknowledge that although I'm not in New York City right now, that normally I would be broadcasting from the lands of the Lenape people. And that is a point that, again, maybe we can return to, because there's been a lot of housing and rent organizing going on in New York City and elsewhere. And that might be a really interesting place to go and thinking about the intersection between our working lives and our home lives and where we live. But I just wanted to thank Carmen and Rebecca for that reminder.
Yes, yes, thank you as well. And I am currently here in Storrs, not too far from campus, which is the occupied territory of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pawcusset, and Nipmuc peoples here in Storrs. And I think that, Rebecca, what you were saying about your book project, I think, I think part of what we can do as Romantic scholars, and something that I advocate for in my work, is to think intensively about our own reading practices, both in terms of what we're selecting, in terms of content to look at, but also in terms of the ways that we are looking, and that the ways that we read and those reading practices that we bring to different texts are very much inflected by our own biases regarding gender and race and sexuality, et cetera, in class. And so I think that that's really, I think that that's important. And I think that that's something as, again, as Romantic scholars, that I think we're in a moment in our field where there are further and further calls to be more conscious of those practices as well.
Yeah, maybe that opens up to an interesting question about whether or not you all have had time to reflect on the ways that our methods of reading or methods of thinking, as we're kind of trained in literary criticism, do or don't align with the moment that we're living in, or do or don't align with the everyday lives that you guys are living as teachers and as writers. So maybe we could start with that as a question.
I can
go ahead, Anna.
That's you, Rebecca. Yeah, no, my dissertation, which is going to be a book project, started as a project solely on gender. And then as I started becoming more politically aware and active, and my dissertation sort of falls in the time frame of the first wave of Black Lives Matter movements. And so it's interesting to see, that continuing and picking up with new energy. So yeah, so the project now is about the way that white women critique the conditions of the Enlightenment for themselves as white women, but do so by casting enslaved and colonized people as backwards in history. So essentially it's critiquing their conditions at the expense of people of color, and particularly women of color. So that sort of intersectional approach that I try to take in my materials definitely has emerged from what's happening in the country in the last several years.
Rebecca, did you have
Sure, yeah, I started my PhD in 2013, and I absolutely think that the unfolding events in this country affected where I looked for topics. And all of us having, Alex, you most recently finishing a dissertation, I think we heed this call to find something at, the cutting edge, so to speak, of our field, something that seems to need attention based on whatever moment that we're operating from. So if I had started it, I really appreciate what you said, Anna, thinking about how these projects, these intellectual projects, can grow over time based on our own life experiences and those of people around us. I wanted to answer also from the perspective of teaching. I have an online class at Portland State. It's an 18th century lit class, and this is their last week of class. They have the term system where they have a fall, winter, and spring term. So this is the last week of a 10-week spring term, and students are I have 33 students, and they're emailing me. They're like, I'm at a protest. Can I get an extension on my essay? Mm-hmm. And I've been saying, I'm asking you to have 3 secondary sources. Why don't you use the speeches that you hear at this protest as one of your secondary sources? Since this 18th century lit class features exclusively books or texts, I should say, by or about enslaved people and free people of color. And so all of their essays are so much speaking to this current moment. And so my invitation to them to rethink what even counts as a secondary source in scholarship has been a really rewarding opportunity for me as an instructor, and to even point them to scholars in our field who are doing just that, and say, look, I know that we often teach you to write in college to look for these credible scholarly sources, but here are some models of scholars in our very field who are using popular, so to speak, popular sources, people's blogs. And I think just to end that thought, the motivation and I guess the stakes behind that is to say scholars of color, and even in the historical moment, voices of enslaved people don't often count as much as white voices in what's considered as scholarship, right? So our field for a long time has been exclusive to people of color. And so to look to other texts to bring those voices in as experts, as authorities to the scholarship that even my students are that I'm asking them to do has been, I don't know if I would have necessarily pushed for that if, for example, my students aren't going to the protests. I was like, well, of course, why don't you use these, the speeches and even the Instagram posts, for example, why don't you use those as your sources for your essays?
Yeah, I think that that's so important. And both a really good reflection on this teaching moment, but also, again, on how kind of Romanticism as a field, you know, and also generally academic scholarship has operated for some time about who counts, whose voices have the most weight, who we're allowed to use. Here at UConn, we're shifting to our writing program to a multimodal curriculum where we're encouraging students to see texts as, you know, all kinds as things that they can be in conversation with and that they can bring in. And I think it's especially important for the reasons that you said, that, of course, traditionally and historically, that people from marginalized communities, haven't had access to the kind of academic circulation of you know, peer-reviewed scholarly work, but also haven't been seen as credible sources that we can engage with. And then I think it's also important for students when they're writing, it opens up different avenues of writing that also don't have to be kind of the super linear, super formal with a certain kind of use of English as well, kind of project.
In terms of teaching too, I think it's a great way to show students, right? I'm not teaching right now, but Rebecca, for you, and if any of us are teaching over the summer, to show explicitly and directly how what we study and what we talk about in the 18th and 19th centuries is still literally with us today. And that what people are responding to in the streets now is part of what we study. And the history behind the text that we read. So I think that's another interesting way of thinking about this moment as a way for us to reapproach and redo the way that we talk about our period in the classroom.
So much trying to legitimize or sanction other voices, but rather actively work to undo the existence of the legitimization as it's operated up to our moment. And Rebecca, yeah, I just really like that as an idea of how to do that by way of kind of in asking your students to rely on protest speeches as secondary sources. I think that's a really good way to think about that kind of not re-legitimization, but rather just undoing the whole logic of this is who can be respected or not respected or heard or not heard. And I oftentimes talk about this with students. I teach Gwendolyn Brooks's Riot almost every semester, partially because it actually works so well with someone like William Blake's work or kind of more experimental poetics in the Romantic period. And the epigraph she starts with is from Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous riots are the language of the unheard. And one thing that I always talk about, or I always try to talk with students about, is this question of not how do we think about language as something that can be made legible, but rather how do we inhabit the space of language that cannot be heard in any kind of traditional or normative sense. Like, what does that language sound like? And I think this kind of that idea segues really nicely with this idea of pulling in speakers from a riot essentially as secondary sources.
Absolutely.
Can I, if I may, 2 follow-ups to Lenora?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the impetus to invite the students to use protest speeches came from an experience I had a few years ago. I submitted a manuscript draft, an essay draft, to a top-tier journal that shall remain nameless. And in the opening paragraph, it was an essay on pro-slavery tracts and how they imagined uprisings in greater potential than abolitionist texts could. So these pro-slavery texts are largely written by planters who were on the ground and had eyewitness experience of enslaved people uprising. And in the opening paragraph, I contextualized the British abolitionist movement in the words of a Black British activist rather than a leading white male historian. And the readers were just not going to have that for this journal. And like naively at the time, I was like, what's wrong with this? But it makes sense. That was pretty early in my PhD program. It makes sense, like the further I went, thinking about these kind of codes of conduct in our field. But Lenora, you mentioned Moten, and I love that. For our listeners, would you mind shouting out a specific title if folks wanted to track that down?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially for thinking about romantic period literature and intersections, Stolen Life is just a phenomenal book. So it has a really, I mean, insanely difficult, but really fabulous engagement with Laura Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, as well as Kant, and reading through like quite a bit of things that we categorize as romantic texts or romantic literature. Yeah, but the Undercommons also is a great, you know, in terms of what you're talking about, right? Like the Undercommons is a fabulous book for thinking about the kind of more pedagogically inflected aspect of this kind of delegitimization or dispossession, I guess is the word that he uses consistently in Stolen Life.
Yeah, something, speaking of unsettling sort of that hierarchy or process of legitimation, something I've run into issues with submitting manuscripts is one of the things I like to do is actually read kind of secondary critical texts as primary texts. And I know that, you know, that's not unique to me. Other people do it, but I've run into a few issues where people kind of feel unsettled by that or feel that, I'm attacking that person. But what we're trying to do when we do that is to set up sort of a pattern of, okay, in our own scholarship, sort of reflectively, here's how the words that people use to talk about these things, and that matters, right? Or the way that this is phrased matters for understanding kind of how in our current moment, how first of all, we're imagining the Romantic era and the long 18th century, but also, how our current moment is inflecting that process.
So it sounds like maybe one of the boundaries that needs delegitimizing that Nora was talking about is genre, right? The genre of the scholarly essay.
Right. Right.
Be something that we're trying to push back on in our work a little bit. But also, when we're teaching, I often, when I'm teaching the essay, teach it as a genre, because then, the next thing that comes up is these are conventions. These conventions change. And if you want to intervene in those conventions, you're doing something, you're making a choice. And that often comes up in my desire for students to use pronouns, to use the discursive I, to talk about themselves in the writing, which then, when you're on a committee with other people who expect the genre of the essay to be upheld by your honors student, suddenly they're sort of getting in trouble for using a bunch of I statements that we had decided together to include for the purpose of framing this essay as coming from a particular place. So I think that's one of those sort of overlaps maybe in what we study, genre, and how we study, which is also a genre.
Yeah, I mean, relatedly, I guess we could think about the genre, but the temporality of writing and the weirdness of the time that it takes to write, an essay, or the weirdness of the time it takes to write a dissertation, or all of these things. And if you guys have been thinking about the ways that working at home or working virtually or any of these kinds of things are having a feedback loop effect on how you're writing, how you're teaching. I feel like time is particularly strange right now, but there might be other aspects that you guys want to touch on too.
I'm obsessed with this right now. I'm trying to turn my dissertation into a book, and so I'm trying to co-author something with Carmen from 10 years ago. And so that time is becoming, there are these fraught moments with myself, and one of the chapters that is completely new that I wrote in the last couple of years, I think about it as my Kavanaugh hearings chapter, because it was written under that pressure, and it's about Charlotte Smith, and it's about being gaslit. And so there's this, there's this interesting way in which the book itself is becoming this kind of document to the way in which I have been moved by these forces. And it's incredibly difficult to create something cohesive that is also a real artifact of time. Yeah.
Okay.
I love that co-authoring with your past self. I write really well socially, out in the world.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to supplement that with digital hangouts or texting a friend, are you going to write? Let's write for 2 hours, things like that. But my writing has suffered in the sense that I haven't been able to be out in the world. I don't think of myself necessarily as that much of an extrovert. Like I've been okay with the alone time, but the writing socially has taken a dip.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've been on the market for the job market for the last, year. And so I think, it sounds like some of you have been as well. I think time when you're on the market generally is just like distorted and confused, and all the more so now, particularly thinking about my relationship to the future. And it just seems, like a black hole oftentimes when you're on the market. But then, when you pair that with the global pandemic, it's hard to imagine like linear time.
Along with that, along with that, Anna, like it's honestly hard to imagine readers, because as I think all five of us have been advocating, a sea change in our field is something we would like to see. So what does that do to the scholarly monograph? Like what does that do to our imagined readers of these types of documents?
Yeah, that's a tension that I felt a lot while I was writing my dissertation, because I was writing a lot about like sort of linear normativity and the assumption of reproduction and things like that. And it feels like, it felt completely contradictory sometimes to be writing these very linear chapters. So I ended up trying out writing a digital one for my fourth and final chapter, because I was like, I couldn't take sort of that. It felt like I was being hypocritical to myself. But at the same time, there are these conventions and expectations that, we have to be able to, if I'm applying to a job and they're looking for a writing sample, it needs to look a certain way. If I'm sending something into a journal, it needs to look a certain way. And so sometimes the negotiating that sort of contradiction was difficult, and it always was. And then I think it was just sort of exacerbated by, writing from home, because my writing practices became a lot more fluid and a lot more, out of sync with itself, where I'd be writing, everybody always writes non-linearly to start off and then arranges it into something. But it felt especially that. I also noticed that my writing tone of voice when I was writing from home, I was finishing up my introduction, and it became a lot more personal, and a lot, sort of the tone relaxed a little bit, because I think I don't know, there was something about sort of being at home that changed some of the context of how I was phrasing things, whereas I did most of my writing either on campus or sort of in a coffee shop or something before. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny the way, Rebecca, I totally identify with that sense that you need to be out with people writing. And I reflected on that quite frequently during my dissertation, the weirdness of like going to a coffee shop to have non-social social interactions, like, people around me, but I'm not going, but like, God forbid someone talk to me because I'm really trying to get this chapter done in some sense. And I really identify with this idea that and maybe it goes back to the matter of legitimation that we were talking about earlier, but I really identify with the sense that there's a kind of a pressing feeling of the sociability and sociality of our writing that's really like at our fingertips right now, but hasn't quite found its way into the expected forms of writing, even though people are producing insane amounts of writing in different kinds of forms and genres right now. But it is interesting to feel this kind of palpable sense of sociability in the things that we're writing that doesn't quite yet have an outlet for the music on our CD. Sorry.
I took on a collaborative project, a collaborative essay that I don't know if I would have sought out if not for this period of isolation.
Interesting. Yeah. And how have you found that in the context of writing from home? I mean, how have you found the co-writing process? I
think maybe the same as it would have been if we hadn't been. My co-author and I have such different schedules that I don't know if we ever would have met in person. We're both in Boulder here, but we used a Google Doc to draft our abstract, and then when it got accepted, we've been continuing to communicate digitally. So I don't know if it would have looked any different, but knowing that I have this this sort of like ready-made I don't know if two people can be a community, but this ongoing project that I have with this other person has been really meaningful to me because I largely just sit at home all day.
Do we want to, I think Anna might have brought up the job market earlier. Would we like to maybe move into a discussion of that? Sounds like a lot of us may have engaged it in some form in the past year. You know, especially in the context of, you know, the past few months, how did it affect our experiences on the job market? Did it affect our experiences on the market? And also kind of what would, if we have any ideas about maybe moving forward, kind of our hopes for maybe what hiring in Romanticism would mean or look like.
I had a virtual campus visit a couple of weeks ago, so that was fascinating. And I would say, I mean, I found the experience this time around, well, and you know, within the last couple of months, the accommodations to be much more accessible than my previous experiences on the market. So the virtual campus visit I loved because I could do it like right here. I didn't have to go anywhere. I could eat my own food and take a nap, whatever. And then for that job I got, for the first interview, I got the questions ahead of time that they were going to be asking. And I think that was an accommodation for people being at home with new and different responsibilities. So those were some tangible things that I experienced that I really appreciated.
Yeah, the in-person visits on the job market are so grueling and very inaccessible. You know, the constant needing to be sort of socially on for, you know, and flying out there as well, on top of, you know, sort of navigating whatever the campus structures are. So I think that, I think that in the move to online, and I think that this is true of teaching as well, that there's a moment to reflect intentionally on how to make things accessible and humane in ways that sort of went invisible before.
I mean,
on the flip side of, I agree with all that. On the flip side of that, though, I had an experience in an interview this year where the folks clearly hadn't used the technology before, and were coming in and out of the interview, like in the middle of, and I had to repeat things, and it was, I mean, I don't think any disrespect was intended, but you know, many of us are learning how to navigate these digital spaces, maybe for the first time. So, again, I think all the intentions were good, but it was an unfortunate side effect. For me, one of the eeriest things this year on the market was seeing jobs evaporate, be frozen, I think is the right metaphor there. As people that I cared a lot about were like on the campus visit stage, right? And then it was digital and then it was frozen. I was part of a few searches towards the end here that, okay, we're doing the interview. Okay, we're doing the digital campus visit. Okay, now we're frozen. And so I think any job year is that process of, I don't really even know, it's like being strung along a little bit. Like you have to invest this belief that there's still that position for you until it's not. And this year was even more, that was just enhanced to another level of that feeling of like, not only could I not get this job could just be gone for everybody. And then all of us who have not found a position are, because at least with someone like, I look at Carmen, like you landed that job that I applied for, and it's like you see the people and you know the people, and you're so happy that Carmen has that job, right. People that you know and love. So I don't know if the rest of you can relate to that, but at least like yes. In the past, like knowing the person who got the job, there was like a sense of, okay, well that person is settled, amazing, like this field is going on.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think, it would make a big difference, or it'd be like, you know, this sense of satisfaction that, okay, the people that I care about, or even if I don't know them, you know, people are getting those jobs, and, you know, I'll see them at conferences and things like that. It'll be great. But yeah, just watching the jobs sort of vanish, and it was already, you know, it was already a year that felt very, you know, it already takes so much emotional labor to apply to jobs in the first place. You know, there was a point where once the university shut down and I started hearing, word that jobs were getting canceled and things like that, where I just stopped applying for like a month because I just sort of mentally couldn't wrap my head around it, because it was like they take so much effort to put together, and the idea of applying to something that might vanish, I didn't have like sort of the extra emotional space to take that risk, I guess. And with everything else going on top of that, it's an emotionally difficult time generally. So I just kind of took a break.
Yeah, I also am close to a few people in Romanticism who have like taken a look at the world around us and have decided that a better life path for them is something outside of academia, where the actions that they can take in a career, maybe an activist career, or maybe, yes, it feels a little bit more politically engaged. And I can respect that and understand that, but I also wonder, like, what has happened to our discipline that makes a career in academia feel not politically engaged?
Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think something that I've run into in the past year or two is there's some difficulty. I mean, there always was, but there's a challenge with, kind of what the realities of kind of graduate students' future employment is versus kind of what we're sort of being mentored in and advocated for. I think both in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of like kind of the scholarship and the possibility for being actively politically engaged in our scholarship and through our scholarship, but also in terms of like sort of just the pragmatic, nuts and bolts of, what kinds of jobs to expect or be prepared for. Most people at UConn, in the past, we've done pretty decent with placing people, but people usually end up in teaching heavy jobs, right?
Carmen, did you have anything you wanted to, I know, you might have similar or different thoughts about having been on the job market?
Well, my experience on the job market was that it was a positive experience this year, obviously. But it was one where maybe I also was sort of taking an extra leap of faith in addition to the university itself, because they hired me over Zoom. I came up to Vancouver for a visit for spring break, and sort of like was feeling maybe like things were going to be moved online. University of Central Florida has a very robust online program regardless of coronavirus. So moving things online seemed like a natural next step for them. Everyone gets trained in online teaching there. So faculty are very comfortable with the platform. So I brought with me my suit jacket, sort of thinking I might get stuck here. Indeed, that's what happened. So I took the job because I'm very sure that it's going to be great, but I have also never been to Regina. So, but part of that has to do with the precarity of being a Canadian working in the States at a time when green cards seem to be something that are sort of dangled and then retracted at whim. So I feel very lucky, extremely fortunate to be back and to have that sense of security.
Yeah, as you guys are kind of talking about the job market, and it's been 3 years now since I was on it, but not that long. And I was on it for 2 years. I was just thinking about how interesting it is, or it's been for me, to shift towards thinking about Romanticism not as a period of industrialization, but as a period of a war waged on subsistence, or the ability to make one's life outside of a wage job, which is generally the way that I'm reading Romanticism at this point. And so, yeah, I was just thinking there's so much that's kind of contemporary about Romanticism with our current moment, if we think about it that way, right? Because not just the precarity of the more abstract precarity of our lives, when we can't get jobs, but also, just the kind of day-to-day difficulties or something of figuring out is it possible to kind of continue on in this academic profession? Do I have to move somewhere else? But yeah, I guess it's mostly a general comment that as you guys were speaking, I was thinking, oh, there's so much that's like interesting about Romanticism right now, because it isn't actually the period that we thought it was for a really long time, which was, you know, the time that was building towards, as you were saying, Alex, this kind of linear or progressive model of history. It's actually shot through with all of these fragmentary times, and feels quite kind of apropos to our present, making it both a very useful and also sometimes difficult period to read in. So, well, maybe jumping off of that in a maybe more utopian vein, I mean, Rebecca, you had brought up co-authorship, but I'm wondering if you guys are thinking right now about what, I mean, especially given the events of the last week, but what forms of kind of collective action, whether that be political or in the classroom or writing, you're thinking about for yourselves right now? I mean, this is a time for experimentation, I guess.
So one example is the Bigger Six Collective, which is pretty active on Twitter, and it's been different things since its sort of inception a couple years ago. But I think the utopian vision for the Bigger Six Collective is as a amplifier, like a megaphone, to amplify the work that other scholars are doing that are, again, like crossing these borders, these boundaries. Mm-hmm. So that's one quick example I would throw out there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
My mind goes particularly to teaching practices, and definitely in direct response to going online and to COVID, but also potentially in response to the last couple of weeks. And that going online and teaching under emergency conditions made me rethink and reconceptualize accessibility in a way that I hadn't before. And so in a way, I'm not grateful about COVID at all, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to rethink accessibility, and particularly in terms just of like nuts and bolts of the classroom, in terms of course policies, late work, attendance, participation in class. I've definitely realized that all of these things are dependent on a certain degree of privilege and access. And that when you're teaching under emergency conditions, those things go away or they become less important. And I don't think that you have to be teaching under emergency conditions for those to become less important. I've come to realize. So I think for me anyway, I've always prioritized equity and access in content, but not, I realize in hindsight, not necessarily in structure and in pedagogy. So that's something that I'm rethinking now for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I'm working on right now, is compiling a lot of resources that exist, but also, yeah, thinking more intentionally about the actual kind of classroom teaching practices, yet not only the content, as important as the content can also be, but right, there are so many things like in assessment and evaluation, for example, that are, really important places to do anti-racist work and to do that process of sort of delegitimizing the hierarchies, and also to invite students to think intentionally about that too. Why do these expectations exist in the classrooms? Where did they come from? Even the history of the field of what is referred to as English, is rooted in trying to construct a particular normative national consciousness to prevent revolt, right? And so I think it can be a really interesting, it's really important in terms of those practices, and also the conversations that we're having with students.
Yeah, if not for COVID, I don't think I ever would have taken the plunge into completion assignments. So my major assignments in the three spring classes that I finished up at Boulder, and then the one online class for Portland State, abolish grades, right? So like these essays and these major projects are now just completion points, and I've never had students do such intensive work because I don't know, like I guess the switch flipped and it became not just about getting this grade and meeting these rubric items and guidelines, but about the work that they wanted to do. So I'm sold. And I really don't think and that's against me, that I didn't have the pedagogical imagination to consider how that would look and how that would work.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also the case that in this kind of weird context that we're in, that things that we all already knew somehow become more accessible in a way. So I'm sure that you had thought about abolishing grades before. I imagine it had crossed your mind at some point, but when the material reality is that students are sitting at home on their computers and not in, what is a reified space of the classroom sometimes, then it becomes far more apparent that the grade is quite arbitrary. So, I mean, one thing that I've been talking to a lot of people about here at NYU is, I mean, of course, notwithstanding the kind of crisis capitalism launch into virtual classrooms that we all know is coming down the pipeline, notwithstanding that this moment of kind of intensive remote access gives us a really interesting way to think around surveillance and securitization mechanisms, especially at a place like NYU, where we have security guards in every single building, and many campuses do. So, we've been thinking about, how can we kind of pressurize the openness that's possible with these kind of virtual platforms and just say, people don't need to pay, students don't need to pay for this, like abolish grades, but abolish tuition too, because this is something that we want to do. And, these are conversations that we can have with people right now who don't have to enter into otherwise quite exclusionary spaces in a very literal sense.
Yeah, I think in a sort of utopian vein, one thing that I wish would happen that I don't have huge confidence with is that, that the university administration would reimagine itself as being pedagogically oriented for our students and doing that important, and for fostering intellectual communities on campus that are doing important work, right? And less, of course, corporate and capitalist oriented. But, I don't have huge hope for that, but, it seems like some campuses are having those conversations. But that would be something I wish would come out of this, because I think the financial pressure that universities are under could be, it's obviously scary what's happening to some schools having to close, but I would hope it would be an opportunity for universities to imagine how and where the funding is going, what it's doing, and who is it for, and who does the university serve.
I mean, this is a moment, I think, again, where material conditions become really important, because as a friend of mine was saying the other day, I can't pretend to give a $70,000 lecture over Zoom. Like, there's no
right.
$70,000 lecture in the world. So all of a sudden, the price becomes totally absurd. And so, right, like, we have to translate that over into, like, why are administrators making insane amounts of money, right? All of these scales of price, which I used to just think about in terms of the ridiculousness of the New York housing market, but included everywhere else, there's just the weirdness that we're all experiencing around what is the relationship, what are the different kinds of values that we place on these things. Like, I can invite anyone into my classroom to have a conversation by Zoom, but I can't imagine how that's worth $80,000 a year.
Right.
It's worth a lot of other things to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or maybe my campus doesn't need a pool in the shape of our mascot. We already have it. It's too late now, but
yeah, I think that, there were some articles that I was reading after I started undergrad the year of the 2008 collapse, and then I ended my PhD with, all of this happening. So it's sort of, my higher ed experience has been completely bookended by, like, financial collapse that also really shaped how I engaged with my education and what, kind of what it was like to go through that.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about my experience of 3 years at the University of Central Florida, where the very first thing they did was require new faculty to take an online teaching pedagogies course, where we built an online course.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very resistant to that move because I had spent so long perfecting my choreographed in person, in classroom song and dance, that was effective, and I knew it was effective. And so to move that all online was really challenging. And although the rhetoric of inclusiveness was bandied about, the undercurrent of, but our English department is expanding, was also bandied about, which is this really interesting and strange thing. And everyone always talked about how big the University of Central Florida was, but I would walk around campus and the campus is not big enough to support 70,000 students. And so it became clear very quickly that most of these students are distributed learners. So, you know, there's this really strange back and forth between my desire to include students, and I really did have amazing experiences with asking students to make videos of themselves doing readings, so that you suddenly realize that a student who you had never seen before has a particular way of being in the world that you never could have imagined if you'd just been reading discussion posts. And that was, you know, something that I'd never had in the classroom, because the classrooms that I've taught in have not been inclusive in that way. And then thinking about how we as instructors need to protect ourselves from the university, from this expansive move to just grab students wherever they can, anywhere in the world. And I think mostly about owning course content, so that we shouldn't be creating courses that can then be retaught by adjuncts. And then the other thing is course evaluations.
Yes.
Course evaluations suffer incredibly from online teaching. I was 30% lower in all of my online classes for course evaluations. And if we continue to value those for promotion, anyone who's teaching online is at a disadvantage. But the university will choose to have pre-tenured people teach online because we're younger and seen as having more facility with online technologies. So yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good summary of both, you know, the things that can be potentially exciting about online teaching and online learning, the things that it affords, but also kind of those, it's almost like this, it's almost like this imperial expansion by universities to try to like, almost like do these kinds of one-off, almost like, you know, to absorb bodies from other places into kind of this megalith corporate structure of the university. And, you know, I think at its best, effective online teaching can do a lot of great things, but you know, it's hard not to see, the potential and the actual realities of the ways that the university would then employ that for you know, profit and, you know, image and things like that. For example, to boost enrollment numbers and be able to use those numbers, right?
When we started the conversation, I identified myself as being this kind of quasi-adjunct for the past year, but in fact, the title I've held for the last 2 years is a digital pedagogy fellow at Boulder. And I took that position basically because of financial insecurity. My PhD was ending, my department couldn't give me teaching. And a couple things impressed me and shocked me right off the bat. And so similar as what Carmen was saying, I received extensive training in digital pedagogy, which kind of blew my mind in these strategies that I had never considered in an in-person classroom, in terms of access, but also in terms of kind of this kind of commodification. And the thing that really concerned me was when I learned that per credit, our online classes at Boulder are more expensive than the in-person classes. And so I'm also a mentor in a program for first generation and underrepresented students at Boulder. It's called the Miramontes Arts and Sciences Program. And a lot of these students are caretakers for family. A lot of them are children of immigrants. Some are undocumented. And so the idea of having flexible access to like taking a class online, I wanted to promote this to those students that were my mentees. And then they came back to me and said, this is so much more expensive than my in-person class. And so I think that's another layer to, I don't know, I don't understand like why that had to be the case for my institution, but if that is the case elsewhere, you know, if we're not selling an experience, I don't even want to use like we and sell in the same sentence. I can't believe I just said that. But if if our institutions aren't selling a buffalo shaped pool or a better dining hall food, I don't know. So these are things that are very concerning to me, and probably even more so as this shift is continuing to happen.
Okay.
I know we were going to talk about utopic. I did want to share one thing that's happened, which is I've always been sort of hungry to be a student again. And this has given me the opportunity to, I signed up for a Indigenous Pedagogies course. It's a MOOC run through UBC. And it was a course that was run last year, and then they've made it available on this edX website so that you can work through the course content yourself for free. So my good friend who's a medical doctor and who lives in Australia and I are taking this course together and doing weekly check-ins where we talk about course content because the course itself is really interested in reconciliation. So it's drawing together scholarship from Australian and Canadian Indigenous scholars to think through those things. So with her being in Brisbane and me being in Canada, it's been really, it has felt like a little window of utopia in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
is there ways for other folks to access that? Do you want to say
yeah,
more?
I could definitely share a URL maybe we could link to it on Romantic Circles.
Yeah.
But it's just through this edX website that it's an aggregator for MOOCs. So you can search for all sorts of courses from lots of different universities, from Harvard to Stanford to Emory. But this one just happened to be run by UBC.
Great.
I mean, I think that too just kind of reminds me again of the way that time is being shaken up right now in COVID, but in all kinds of other ways too, in the sense that I had it too, that all of a sudden I had time again in a weird way, even though of course the transition to teaching took a different kind of time, but all of a sudden, for the first time in 2.5 years, I was like, I'm putting writing aside and I'm just going to focus on the mutual aid work that's developing in New York and all of these other kinds of things. And it has actually been, not to say again, there's nothing utopic about COVID, but the fact that time feels available again all of a sudden has been kind of an amazing experience, and something that you just realize disappears really quickly once you kind of get sedimented into work time of a particular kind.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing about working from home is that I can also put what I'm doing down and get up and go play with my cats for an hour or something, or take a walk around on my street, which I could do when I was on campus from kind of 9 to 5, but it's something that when you're kind of trapped in the little office that you don't always think about doing those kinds of things for yourself until you get hungry or something. So I think it's also brought sort of more of a bodily awareness too, in addition to that time, that it's almost like the clock I'm following is more sort of my own embodied rhythms, as opposed to kind of a punch card kind of thing.
And our students are doing that as well, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, thinking about in terms again of how to make classrooms accessible, either in person or not, and that's even access to internet is another degree of privilege
Right.
to take into account with the potential shift online. So I think just trying, again, I'm trying to accommodate a range of student experiences that doesn't necessarily presume that all they're doing is taking classes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And I mean, not to get too granular about online teaching strategies, but I think this is a reason that asynchronous online, to me, feels like the more humane way of managing, at least in terms of the crisis, in managing the transition to online, rather than requiring some sort of Zoom experience that has to happen at a particular time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think, asynchronous, the designing the course asynchronously, and then if in constructing sort of optional, my cat's going to enter the frame here. Constructing optional synchronous moments for students who want that kind of community, or, scheduling sort of small group work. Because something for me that I have to navigate is that I have a lot of students in China. And so of course, trying to do anything synchronously even if they have internet access, is going to be really challenging, just in terms of time zones. But, maybe I'll have office hours at 8 or 9 p.m. my time that they can, log into if they'd like to. But then there are issues with VPNs and if I put everything in Google, they can't access Google. So I think one of the exciting things about online learning that, I'm trying to keep my cat out of the camera here, for me is I've been doing course development for a couple of years, but, there's something that's clicked with how I'm designing things like learning objectives and learning goals after going through some more intensive training online, and designing, assignments and activities from there, where I feel just even more, I feel like I had settled into too comfortable of a rhythm with my in-person teaching, I guess. And as I'm going through designing these courses online, as somebody who values course development a lot, it's given me a lot more to think about, and a lot of new strategies for designing things as well.
Carmen, maybe you can relate to this when you did your pedagogy training for online teaching. One of the things I resisted was like, I need this whole class planned out. And that's not how I did things in the past. Like, I'd want to swap things out. I'd want to see how the term went, and maybe we would read this and not that. And for the online teaching, at least the way I was trained to do it, you need this course built, you need the schedule in place, you need the outcomes.
Yep.
That was my major discovery immediately. It was like, oh, I'm not a teacher, I'm an administrator of this course.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like the designer, and then I'm the administrator, but at no point am I really the teacher of this course. Mm-hmm. So yes, that was, it broke my heart. I spent like 2 years with a broken heart before I was able to like mend it enough to be like, I can do this. I can find something good about this.
I think I spent a summer with a broken heart, but I think being forced to pivot my way of thinking in terms of this kind of administrative hat, I want to use the word, I feel like it made me a little bit more honest in the ways that I was choosing texts and the larger narrative and the structure I was trying to spin for them. Spin? Am I a DJ now? I'm not sure. I'm an administrator. But anyway, being invited or forced to pin down this entire course structure at the outset, I think I had to make more, I had to be more sure in my own decisions of why I was picking these things ahead of time, and to have a through line in the structure that I could identify and articulate. So I think that, I think my teaching I think I will carry that through the rest of my teaching career, like that impetus to set out and define like these big stakes with all of these texts and all of these discussions at the beginning. And yeah, things can shift and morph still if they need to. There are still ways we can be flexible, but when I have a 15-week schedule with every due date and every reading assignment down to the page number produced the day before the class begins, like that's a completely different way of me having to be honest about the trajectory and the stakes of this class than I ever had to be before that.
Right.
I mean, what I'm hearing from a lot of this discussion about online teaching, whether it be over a longer arc of time or more recently, actually, is that people really value the experimentation that is possible in it. And that's precisely what the administrative side of online teaching doesn't want, right? That like the whole reason of shifting to online courses is a measurement and calculation move. Whereas, what it seems like everyone is saying in terms of their experience with online teaching, that what it's afforded them is an ability to kind of experiment or expand beyond what they would normally have done in the classroom, which is a really interesting kind of dialectical takeaway or something from the online education experience.
Yep. Yeah.
Like the part that's not measurable.
Yeah, and I think that there's an opportunity too for instructors, sort of being more of that like administrator of the course kind of role that Carmen was talking about, to, if we fade a little bit more in the background, it becomes more about the students and the student work and interaction too in that space. I think it can be, an opportunity to upset sort of the like instructor-student hierarchy that I think, the classroom space physically is kind of designed around, right? And to, once things get kind of despatialized, I guess, or moved into an online space, that's possible. Again, although, as everybody's been saying, as Lenora was just saying, there's also this danger of sort of the corporate sort of numbers and measurement approach to online learning that we're kind of trying to navigate around or be sneaky around, I guess. So.
You also have to evade students' habituated patterns of interacting with the internet.
Yeah. Oh, right.
That's one of the things that when I did start to feel like, okay, I'm being pedagogically tactical now in the way that I'm setting up course content. I'm making everything inductive so that searching for material, like searching for information, is very difficult. To stop students from interacting with my course like they interact with Google, where they have a question and then it gives them an answer and they just pick the first one.
Right.
And so that too has been something to think about, that the actual experience of learning on the internet or in a computer screen also activates habituated patterns of behavior that students have developed for interacting with different kinds of things, whether that be entertainment or information.
I think this has actually been a kind of surprising and lovely conversation for the fact that although we've been talking around kind of contemporary crises and uprisings, that there's been just some really fabulous reflection on and kind of thinking through, the less like in our face aspects of these things, the ways that, online teaching, for instance, has been something that people have been negotiating for a long time. And I think those kinds of reminders are really useful in a moment where everything feels so sped up. So I appreciate all of that input from everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've kind of gotten to a place where, we can maybe wind some things up. So, as we're preparing to close, does anybody want to offer any last thoughts?
Thank you again to the organizers for getting us all together and facilitating this great conversation.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks to Romantic Circles for a long time being a leader in our field for imagining these creative ways or non-standard ways of interacting and doing scholarship.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And I want to kind of put a plug here. If anybody, either here in the panel or anybody who will be watching this, anybody would like to do a roundtable like this, they can email one of us and submit just a brief description of what you'd like to do, and we can talk about it and then host it as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all so much.